let's talk about making some marks. So what you need to do is grab the brush tool, which is this, and you're going to start to notice that as you grab these tools, these little things pop up and it says brush tool parenthesis B. What those parentheses are hotkeys. So that means I could either click on this with my mouse, or I can just type the letter B into the keyboard and it automatically grabs the brush. Okay. And so you're going to start to notice that these hotkeys allow you to move fluently very fast through the tools. Whereas if every time you're coming here and you're clicking the tool you want, that's a good way to start. It's a good way to familiarize yourself with the tools, learn the icons. But eventually you want to push yourself to learning the hotkeys because it's just going to make you real fast in Photoshop. Okay? And the hotkeys are going to carry over to the other programs that we're going to work with. And hotkeys that are very, very common, that I very, very commonly use, are B for the brush, V for the move. That's essentially like the grab tool, grab stuff with it. And then E for the eraser. I use these hotkeys all the time. I'm constantly pressing B. Oh, you got to get out of text mode to do this. I'm constantly pressing B, go to the brush, E, go to the eraser, and you can see here it changes as I press B or E or V. These are quick ways to grab the tools you want. So let's grab the brush tool, press B, okay? And on my screen, what you're seeing is this little does not work icon, this little circle with a cross through it. Not going to work, not equal sign. The reason that it's a not equal sign right now with the brush tool is because I can't draw on a text layer. Right now I'm on this text layer, okay? So I need to select a layer on which I can draw, and then all of a sudden my brush icon pops up, okay? Now, one reason I always like to do Photoshop with a mouse is because I'm always using that right click. So let's talk about some of the properties of the brush that we can change right away. So if you do a right click, one of the things I'm constantly always changing is the size of the brush. Okay, so there's this little arrow. You can make the brush big. Obviously, that's going to make a gigantic mark. Okay, you can make the brush small, and that's going to make small marks. Okay, you can change the size of the brush. So size is one thing I'm constantly changing. So let's get a big brush, a big size brush. Okay, and if you're using a drawing tablet or drawing on the screen on a tablet, you should be able to press harder to get fatter and fatter lines, or press lighter to get lighter lines. Okay, and that's going to be really useful. You're going to want to get used to that. So spend a little time, make a little mark, make some marks, and experiment with your brush a little bit. Now, another feature of the brush that I am just constantly always optimizing, always changing, is the opacity. So if you remember, we could change the opacity of a layer, and that made the layer transparent, made it see-through. You can do that with your brush. So if you want to paint what would essentially be in a black and white drawing, oftentimes if you've ever seen like what do you call it? The India ink. So like India ink is stuff like this, where this is just a very, very common look of things you can do with India ink. And you can do these gray washes where you're adding more water, you're adding more transparency to the blackness. So here's one, and there's another one with some trees. We can do this. We can do these sort of gray washes in Photoshop. Okay, and the way that you do that is you come up here while your brush is selected. You have to have a brush selected, and you can change the opacity, okay? And you can, let's make it 22%. That means it's going to be 22% black. And so you see it's gray. And what you're seeing is underneath, you're seeing the layer underneath. So you're seeing the whiteness come through of a 22% black pen, okay, or brush. And if I I do it multiple times over top the same mark, you can start to really develop shades with gray washes, okay? And this is much of how I do shape, how I develop contour, is by optimizing the opacity of my brush and then doing layers of gray washes, which progressively add shape and contour. Now, the other thing with the brush that I am constantly changing is if you right click, okay, so right click and look at your brushes. What newbies do not realize, okay, so this is a very, very common newbie mistake, is that there are many different kinds of brushes, okay? And each of these brushes produces different effects. It's like painting with many, many, many different brushes, okay? And many people, the default is this soft, round brush, which I think actually it looks horrible for a drawing. And so a common newbie mistake is people will select the brush tool and they will try to paint, and they'll paint with this blurry edged brush, okay? And it looks terrible for drawings because when you're making drawings, you really want the sharpness. Now, there are contexts under which you might want this blurry brush for sure, but most of the time when I'm using a blurry brush, it's for contour, gray washes, or for color paintings. So what you should do right away is get out of that soft round brush, okay, and click on a different brush that's going to have either the hard round brush, okay, so that's the one that's going to give you a sharp line, or what I like are these kind of like Sharpie marker brushes. So here's one. You're going to have different brushes than me because each Photoshop is going to come with different preloaded brushes. And we'll show you eventually in the future how to make your own brushes. But one of the ones I like are these sort of cartooning brushes that have sharp edges and allow you to get in the corners and make real sharp lines. And there's also specialty brushes, okay? So if you imagine whatever this thing is, oh, let's see if I can even do it. Let's do this one, the splatter brushes. See, look, you can paint with splatters. So if you remember back to that goblin, this is how I was painting some of that mud splatter. Okay, so a lot of times when you need to do detail or stippling, selecting the right brush is really important for the job. If you're a cartoonist, if you're interested in like cartooning, there's the, I don't know what you call this. I think this is called like halftone, kind of like shading. This is super useful in like cartooning. What other brushes do we have here? I make my own brushes that kind of mimic Sharpies. And if you're ever going to do like cross hatches, you can make your own brush which has like multiple lines. Sometimes I'll do stuff like this. And I'll teach you how to make your own brushes in the future pretty soon here. But spend a little time, get used to selecting different brushes, test out and experiment with the different kinds. And then when you're comfortable with that, come back and we'll learn the eraser. So if you remember, the hotkey for the eraser is E. Okay, so press E. And that'll pop you up with your eraser. Now make sure we're on the layer that you made your marks on. And what you need to understand right away is that the eraser tool itself is also a brush. Okay, so if you have the soft round eraser, it's going to erase with soft round edges. And sometimes you might want to use this, okay? Sometimes you might want to do this. Sometimes you might not want to do that. Sometimes you might want to erase with a real sharp, oh, I'm on the brush. Get the eraser. Sometimes you might want to, what in the hell? See, I have my own problems in Photoshop. Sometimes, even though I'm an expert, sometimes you might want to change the eraser brush. So here, grab the hard round one, and you can see now I'm erasing with a real hard edge. Okay, so sometimes you're going to want to erase in different ways. And sometimes you might only want to erase half of the tone. So remember how we can change the opacity of the brushes. You can also change the opacity of the eraser. So I might only want to erase like a little bit of this line in a sense that I want to make it a little bit of see-through. And I can erase half of sort of that layer and allow transparency, allow myself to see through it. And I can progressively keep erasing by adjusting the opacity of the eraser. Obviously 100% is going to erase everything completely. Okay, so erase everything completely, get used to that, and experiment with your eraser just as much as your brushes. And sometimes using the eraser as a brush in itself can also be really interesting. For example, if you made a layer, okay, and let's say the layer, the background, was black. Okay. Now what you can do, sometimes what people will do is they will use the eraser almost as like a pen, and they will make drawings in the black, okay? And sometimes the aesthetics that come out of doing this sort of reciprocal kind of drawing by erasing, can be really interesting. So if you like woodcuts or wood engravings, which I'm a huge fan of, this is sort of the philosophy of wood engravings. So here's an example where they start with a completely black palette, and each line you carve out is progressively going to show more and more white. So it's kind of a different a way to approach creating images, and the aesthetic that comes out is really beautiful. So just be aware that your eraser, you should be just as fluent with your eraser as you are and come to be with your brushes. Now, I just want to lay out some terminal marking philosophy. So marking philosophy. This is sort of my personal opinion on making art. And you're going to hear me sort of criticize people's pieces for saying this, okay? What I want to say is that every time you make a mark on the piece of paper, there should be a purpose for that mark, okay? There should be, if I was to do these, to draw these little hairs, there should be a purpose for those. Like, I'm making those for a reason. Every single time you push your pen to the paper, there should be a reason for that. And every time you choose to leave something like that right there should be a reason for you making that choice. It's the same thing as if you were to write a book or a journal article. You would not fill the journal article with random crap. You would edit out everything that's not essential to the plot that you are trying to tell. And it's the same thing with making marks, okay? So I'm going to look at people's drawings, and I'm going to zoom in at 600%, okay, in certain areas, and I'm going to say, what's the reason that you put that little mark there? What's the reason that you didn't erase this little dot? Does that actually contribute to your product? Or did you forget to erase that dot as because you forgot about it? Okay, so what you need to learn is you need to learn to pay attention to detail. This is what makes learning how to draw so useful, is it forces you to consider the purpose of every single mark.